Mr. Burns? Is Mr. Burns here to discuss procurement issues on CEO search options? I believe he is.
Maybe he changed his mind. Good afternoon, Mr. Burns.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, board members. Al Burns, Director of Procurement and Contracts Administration. When it became, when Ms. Egan, when it came not public knowledge that Ms. Egan was going to be departing us, and I wish you best of luck, ma'am, in your future endeavors. I was asked to look at the other options for procuring an executive search firm. At that time, prior to this, before Ms. Egan's announcement, as you well know, that I do sort of a double duty. 50% of my time is the procurement director of PSTA and the procurement director at HART. Well, PSTA, we just awarded a contract to 7 firms for executive search. I vetted the idea with GC on us piggybacking off of the PSTA contract. I checked with Alan Zimmett, PSTA General Counsel. I checked with David Smith, HART General Counsel, and they both feel that the language in the PSTA contract is sufficient for HART to be able to piggyback. After I spoke with General Counsels, I then met with, over telephone conference, I brought in Brooke Basquette, the HR director for HART, and Larry Longnecker, the HR director for PSTA, and I asked both of them if the contract was suitable to be used for an executive search. And I believe I got concurrence from both HR directors from PSTA and HART. In short, one of the options that's at your disposal is the utilization of the PSTA contract. And the composition, and what I would like to explain to you is the composition of the PSTA contract. I submitted to, as an action item to the PSTA board, myself and Larry Longnecker, once again the HR director for PSTA, and I'm just going to read to you the action item. PSTA may have current and future needs for background. PSTA may have current and future needs for recruiting services that will conduct national searches for the most qualified individuals to fill various positions. On August 11th, 2017, a request for proposal was issued in compliance with PSTA's procurement policies. The solicitation was posted on PSTA's website and DemandStar with direct notices sent to PSTA's supplier list. The term of the contract shall be for 3 years from award of the contract with 2 one-year options not to exceed 5 years. On September 19, 2017, 7 proposals were received. Review factors were qualifications of the firm, management plan, and schedule. Proposed fee. The evaluation committee met on October 26 to discuss its evaluation findings and was provided an opportunity for rescoring proposals based on discussion of findings by the committee. All proposals were deemed responsive and prices considered fair and reasonable. A responsibility review was conducted on each of the 7 firms. The contracts do not guarantee any amount of work or expenses. Anytime PSTA needs a professional recruiting service, a task order will be issued based on the firm's expertise and agreed upon pricing. I'm just going to pause here. In Mr. Smith, the task order process, General Counsel is very familiar with the task order process that we use for legal services, and is the same process that would be followed for the executive search. Fiscal impact. Recruitments are conducted on an as-needed basis, with recruitment costs usually offset by the salary vacancy savings for the recruited position. In addition, an estimate for recruiting costs is included in the annual operating budget. It is proposed that each firm be contracted for up to 5 years, 3 initial years plus 2 additional option years at the discretion of the PSTA CEO in board notification, or $300,000 in allocated task order per firm, which comes first. Recommendation: award contracts to Sunshine Enterprise USA LLC, Krauthammer and Associates, Renee Narlock and Associates, Jury Solutions, Slavin Management Consultants, KL2 Connects LLC, and Transpro Consulting, an amount not to exceed $300,000 per firm for the duration of the contract. There are 7 firms, and the logic that I use behind awarding 7 contracts. First off, there is no guarantee that anyone is going to get any work. However, some of the firms are here local, and for PSTA's need or HART's future need, there may be a need to, for example, at PSTA, they have a need for an IT director. They're going to search that locally. So out of those 7 firms, there are about 2 firms that are here local that can be used. They're mirroring HART in a number of ways. For example, Mr. Campello, our PMO director, they're right now doing an executive search for the PMO director. But they're not limiting that to the region or to the area. So there's another firm that they'll solicit to help them with that search. All 7 proposals I provided to the director of HR for her review. I'm not sure what her findings were, but I would tell you that based on the PSTA procurement director, there's at least 3 qualified firms to do CEO searches. So there are other. So that's one option. As the board chair, I do whatever the will of the board is, and you can direct me or direct staff however you see fit. But it would be my recommendation that this is the cleanest route without having to do any type of deviation to procurement policy or any type of policy as far as HART is concerned. That concludes my summation or my summary of one of the options. I'm available to you, and I'll be more than happy to answer any questions at this time.
Are there any questions?
Mr. Chair, I have a question too, but you can get to me when I'm in the queue.
Well, you're in the queue. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Can you go over the list? I mean, this is fairly common practice to, vet qualified agencies and then put them on your list to use, and I guess that's what you're doing here. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am, that is correct.
Okay. And can you tell me the 7 firms again, because I couldn't quite hear all of them?
Yes, ma'am, and my pronunciation might not be spot on, but it's inside your board packet. Award contracts to Sunshine Enterprise USA LLC, Krauthammer and Associates, Renee Narlock and Associates, Jury Solutions, Slavin Management Consultants, KL2 Connects LLC, and Transpro Consulting.
Okay, so Transpro. Okay. Let me ask you a question. I mean, this is kind of something I've been, since Catherine announced that she was leaving, darn it, and I just wanted to see if this would be something that maybe we could consider. Would be possible allowing a consultant to apply to help us search for, somebody that comes in and actually does transportation consulting, and they're not exactly a human resources firm, but they do consulting work for transit agencies to come in, or could they also apply to, quote, be the CEO? Would we have to change the rules to allow somebody to do that, or, do you understand what I'm trying to say?
Commissioner Merriman, I think you just confused everyone.
Okay.
Everyone is looking perplexed here. Could you kind of say that again, because I'm not quite sure I understand what you're saying either.
Okay, so I'm going to give you an example, but I'm not sure this is the right individual, and I'm not advocating for anybody. But Mark Ash, I think he's with, is his company TransPro? Yeah. Okay. So he's already on the list, but could a consultant like that actually apply for the CEO position?
That's not a procurement question. I would defer to the HR director or the CAO on that.
Well, a couple of things. This is David Smith, General Counsel. Obviously, they can apply, but they cannot be the consultant and an applicant at the same time. They cannot rule it.
I know.
So
I didn't know they were going to be, an applicant. I mean, I didn't know they were going to be somebody that was going to review applications.
Well, they are on the list.
yeah, you haven't selected one yet. They're just among the potential selectees.
Okay, so if we didn't select them, they would be eligible to possibly apply for the CEO position.
Unless he resigns from TransPro.
Okay, I got you. Okay, you answered my question.
Right.
I know, I don't want it to be confusing to anybody, but there are transit agencies across the nation that have hired consultants to actually come and manage their organization while they're looking for their CEO. And I've always thought that was a very intriguing idea because I think HART is going through a transformation period right now where we're trying to elevate ourselves to, instead of a bus system, more of a transit agency. So, I mean, that's the only reason I bring it up.
Okay. Councilman Suarez, you're next.
Yes, I'm Al, if you could help me with this contract. I'm trying to figure this out. So we've got you're awarding to 7 recruiting companies for the contracts. This is what you had worked on with the PSSTA and what you're recommending that we do now. The $300,000 that you're talking about, that's not to exceed $300,000, not a $300,000 contract, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Do they, let's say for an example, I don't know what all the skill sets are for each one of these recruiting firms. And I don't know if one is better at, going after HR directors or bus drivers or CEOs or so on.
Yes, sir.
Do you then award, like a lot of recruiting firms, they get a percentage on the back end after they get hired, a percentage of whatever the salary is that's offered? Is that the way they get paid in terms of this, or how does it work?
That's a very good question, Councilman Suarez.
That's why they pay me the big bucks, Al. I come up with good questions.
One of the dilemmas with awarding this contract was that the various firms came up with various fee structures. Mm-hmm. As General Counsel and staff will let you know, on a task order-based contract, we negotiate that task order-based contract. David knows that oh too well. We issue a task order, we have them come back, and they submit a proposal with the pricing. Then in this case, for example, Krauthammer and Associates, very well-known firm in the transit industry from a recruiting perspective. They've helped us in the past. If you were to say, I'll move forward with Krauthammer, I get in contact with their point of contact and say, submit to me a proposal. From there, I would hand that proposal off to Ms. Lee, to General Counsel, and Mr. Seward, and they would say, hey, Al, you need to go back and you need to get this lowered to this certain price range, and this is what we can and cannot afford. At that time, that's when I would enter into negotiations with Krauthammer and Associates, just as an example, and come back to a fee that is reasonable. So I can't answer your question just flat out that, hey, it's 20% or it's 15%, but it would be something that would be negotiated, mm-hmm. and that would be fully vetted with the C-suite, as we call it.
Let me ask you, would it be easier to just allow, that we piggyback off this contract, this is what you're suggesting anyway, yes, and saying, listen, we've got these 7 firms, they can go out and find a recruit and then bring them to us based on what they believe are the factors that we're looking for a CEO. And then we would pay them based on the fact that they get hired as opposed to having to pay any upfront dollars. Is that a possibility, or is that what you're talking about? Because it sounded a little bit more complicated the way you said it than what I'm saying, at least in my own mind.
Well, if that's the will of the board, I guess I could try that. Okay. However, there are it would have a fiscal impact. Going out in recruiting, if I'm not mistaken, it does require a certain level of effort and a certain level of man hours that are associated with that. So, me as a procurement professional, I'd have to sit back and I'd have to ponder on that for a while and say, am I being fair to ask even the small, I can't remember off the top of my head, I'll just say TransPro, that doesn't have a background in recruiting, but they are capable of doing it. Is it fair for them to expend 80 man hours in searching and finding a person and bringing them back and not being compensated? Also, I would ask you to take into consideration that having one, and there's only so much talent in the country for a CEO, and are we going to be crossing lines? And with Krauthammer and since I brought them up, TransPro Consulting, would they be contacting the same person? So I'm not quite sure I could do that if that's the board's chair will. But I think, to me, if you were to ask me, Mr. Burns, what's your recommendation? My recommendation would be for staff to come back. Brooke Basqueet has had an opportunity to look at the proposals that have been submitted and say, hey, maybe we don't need to have all 7, but let's take a good hard look at these top 3 firms, 2 or 3 firms, and say, let's use these and out whichever proposal we can negotiate for the best value, we enter into an actual contract.
Well, then let me clarify then. So you're going to come back to us with selection of at least one of these firms that are already approved to allow them to go out to find our CEO based on your recommendation, correct?
On staff's recommendation.
Right. So now, not you personally.
Yes,
or it could be your personal opinion too. It's okay, but whatever we want to decide afterwards. But that's what you're going to do. You're going to look at these 7, and the only thing you're asking for us now is the permission to talk to these 7 that are part of the other contract to see if they're interested in who you might select in order to come forward to us. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. That is
okay.
correct.
I just wanted to clarify it because when you see this, obviously. I'm not an expert on recruiting or recruiting in the transit industry. I wasn't sure if you were asking us to pick one or if you were going to make a recommendation either today or after we have our board meeting next week. So that's where the confusion was in my head. I am a big believer, and I know that after your answer, I understand what some of the problems are, but I find that when you offer competition to people, people want to compete. Especially when they know that there's something at the end of the line. If we had, let's say you decided on allowing those 7 to compete and saying, look, you can go out and find whoever you want to find, but whoever gets hired based on your recommendation, you're the one that's going to get the golden egg. I don't have a problem with that. And I think most companies, especially recruiting companies, are used to that. If it's the board's will to not do that, I'm fine with it too. But I like to see more competition because I think that you'll get a better CEO out of this. I mean, let's face it, Ms. Egan would have been a CEO at some point in her career, somewhere else, if not here. But she was someone that was working with Philip Hale and essentially learned from him in order to get to this position. I hope I'm not talking out of school, Ms. Egan. So you might find somebody who is not already a CEO, but a second tier, or maybe even a third tier, that's going to turn out to be a tremendous CEO. So that's what we need, is that kind of expertise, the people to find, a diamond in the rough, let's say, or somebody that is ready to go now that has matured in, let's say, a larger agency, but doesn't have the kind of CEO experience that even Ms. Egan had on an interim basis. So, but thanks for explaining it to me and making me understand a little bit better.
Yes, sir.
So, Councilman, if I may, you make a lot of very excellent points. Customary within transit, to Al's previous point, there aren't that many folks out there that are moving. And it would, my recommendation, it would behoove you to work with a firm that knows who some of those folks are to start with. So my recommendation would be allow staff to evaluate, come back through the firms that seem like they have the best national experience. But absolutely what you're talking about, these firms do not make their money because they just only look at other CEOs. They make their money on the reputation of that person being in the seat. So if you go with a firm as opposed to 3 or 4 trying to compete, a firm is going to bring you several candidates that you winnow through, and the ultimate measure of success is how well did that person do there. And if the reputation is firm A brought in a solid CEO candidate. So the firm that brought in Miss Lee is on this list, and we've been extremely satisfied, very, very happy with Kenyatta. Then that's how they get that business in the future. It is not customary within transit, I'm not saying it has to be this way, to have numerous firms trying to pick several different candidates to come forward because, again, they're doing an awful lot of work. They're flying candidates down. They're making that investment. They do that if they know that one of these successful candidates is going to be selected. And if they don't bring you a good candidate, they don't get paid for the work, and they understand that. So my recommendation, let staff see who's got good national experience and who is going to be committed to looking different layers in transit entities and potentially at the board's discretion outside of transit. I don't think our agency is at the point that you need somebody to come in and tell this excellent staff how to do their jobs. As they've shown through the Hurricane and Mission Max, they don't need someone to tell them that. Maybe what you're looking for is somebody who's stronger in Tallahassee, somebody who has more legislative experience, somebody who's better at going out with those meetings, somebody who is not going home to a 5- and 4-year-old, but they can do more of those trips. That may be where the board lands. Let staff find you the firm that can bring that person to you.
Okay. Ms. Melendez, you're next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a nod to Commissioner Merman, if you're still there. I wanted to, you pointed out some specifics, and I wanted to just note that, the names listed or the firms listed, I think we're all familiar with TransPro and Mark, and I think he's certainly done a great job for us. But in reference to the concern that Commissioner Merman brought up, I would think that in the course of negotiations, or Al, maybe you can address this, there would be a preclusion that if anyone in a certain company expressed an interest, that would certainly preclude them from participating in the search, whether it be part of their executive team, or if we then brought all 7 on board, let's say, they would then, again, if at some point someone said, I want to be considered, I think we have to be careful that by being brought into the fold that they didn't get some kind of competitive advantage or some inside thing. So I would think that once we pick the firms for that initial, we'll call it a library, not to use an inappropriate term, but that's what it sounds like to me, that they're going to be on call and we'll assign task work orders as negotiated. I just wanted to point that out, that I would imagine that there would be some kind of communication on your part to first affirm that there's no one that is interested in the position, and then and if at such time later that occurs, then that would preclude them from participating in the search. They would have to then
Director Melendez, you brought up an excellent point. It is common practice here at HART that we're a pretty knowledgeable and a pretty smart group here at the agency when it comes to transit. But we know things that we do good, and we know things that aren't in our, what we call a subject matter expert or a SME. Oftentimes we hire subject matter experts, A&E firms, consultants, what have you. And they know after they help us with the scope of work or the technical specifications, what have you, that precludes them from being part of the procurement process, or precludes them from being eligible for award of a subsequent contract. That those rules would stand in place for this. So, for example, if Slavin Management Consultants, their principal, we say our staff go out and negotiate with them to get us a good contract. Their principal couldn't turn around and apply for the position here at HART. That would be, as you said, good procurement term, that would give them a competitive edge.
Okay, I just had a quick follow-up. So I also wanted just to note, Al, I think that, as presented, this is a good plan. I think it's efficient, takes advantage of the fact that we do have, in the spirit of partnership with PSTA, it takes advantage of, investment that's already been made in this, and I think that's a great thing. So I applaud you for that. And then regarding, there was just one other point, regarding transit versus other experience. I think Catherine, you brought up a great point that, at least in my thoughts on this before the meeting today, I was thinking that we're going to have to be open-minded and creative when we look at this. And I say that not just because there may be a limited pool, but also because of the direction that Ms. Egan has taken us in beyond the bus. And so I concur with that approach. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay. After that discussion, what's your pleasure to make a recommendation to take forth to the full board?
I'll move to send the recommendation as recommended as presented to us from Albert to the full board.
And there's a motion by Commissioner Murma, second by Mr. McLean. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor, let me know by saying aye.
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 Opposed, likewise. Motion is adopted. Now, let me ask you a question.
Yes, sir.
It is a known fact that in Pittsburgh, every college or professional team wears black and gold. And you come up here today with a dark suit and a gold tie. You trying to tell us something?
I just wanted to show Ms. Egan my support.
Okay.
Well, excuse me, Chair. I have to give you a little bit of trouble here because let's face it. Okay, Pitt is not black and gold, but we do know that Army is black and gold, if I'm not mistaken. Is that correct, sir?
That is correct.
All right, so we'll give them that. How's that?
Well, I'm gonna make one more last pitch, Ms. Egan. Ms. Egan,
Yes,
after today, the high in Pittsburgh is going to be in the 40s and the low is below freezing. You sure you want to change that for the remainder of the year?
You can dress better in colder weather, yes, sir.
Dress better in colder weather. Okay.
Yes, sir, you can.
Chair, I think that she just has a bunch of boots that she hasn't been able to wear while she's been here. That's the only reason she's moving.
All right. Okay. All right. Moving on.
We digress.
CEO criteria, job description. Who's leading that discussion for us?
I believe that is Ms. Lee, and the CEO job description has not been reviewed potentially since 2007 because Philip came in as an interim under, not duress, but interesting circumstances, and I filled in for Mr. Hale. So we have not posted a job description for 10 years. We've done a lot of changes with our own HR team. We have cleaned up a lot of the stuff, and I think Ms. Lee just wanted to lead the conversation of what is it the board wants to see in this job description.
Kenyatta Lee, Chief Administrative Officer. In your package, you actually have a draft of a job description that we kind of reformatted based on our current situation. So I wanted to actually get some feedback from the board on what they wanted to see in the job description, but this is kind of consistent with other job descriptions I've seen for other CEOs of transit agencies.
Okay. Did you have opportunity, members, to review the job description? Do you have any questions or concerns? Any questions or concerns? Commissioner Mervin, any questions or concerns?
No.
Okay,
Sounds good to me.
what's your pleasure to carry forward
We
to
will,
the board?
if I could, Chair, we'll move this to for full board to look at and approve.
Second.
A motion by Councilman Suarez, second by Mr. Melendez to move the draft job description onto the full board. Seeing no further discussion, all those in favor, let me know by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, likewise. Motion adopted. Thank you, ma'am. Transition strategy, appointment of an interim CEO. Mr. Smith, you're going to lead us in that?
Yes. Good afternoon again. As you recall, last couple of times we did this, or at least the one I was here for, we appointed the current the current CEO as the interim CEO. We love it. We're just kidding.
You're not allowed to discuss the next item.
You're just kidding. Okay, I'm just kidding. No, we weren't. And it seemed to work well. And the suggestion that staff has come up with after talking it over and thinking about what might work best is they're suggesting you use the same approach this time. You have an interim CEO during the search. They're proposing that Jeff Seward, who you are very familiar with, serve as that interim CEO, and that we enter into an interim CEO contract, as we did with Ms. Egan. And we have a draft of that. It's attached to your documents. It's going to be fairly standard compared with what you did before. There's a couple of issues, however, that will need to be addressed and decided. One would be the rate of compensation. And there are some policies that bear on that issue that you should be aware of. I think the policies are in the background material as well. And I think, Ms. Lee, do you want to explain those, or do you want me?
We have actually policies and procedures in our handbook that states that if somebody takes an interim position, that they'll get paid between 10% and 15%. I reviewed the documentation related to Mrs. Egan's appointment as interim, and it looked like it was around 16%. So I think that the board took at that time an outside approach to actually setting the compensation for the interim, because it's not really conducive to an individual that's under a contract. It's more for individuals that are on staff. So that will be my recommendation: is to take this as an incidental incident and actually propose something that's a little bit different than actually what's in the handbook related to traditional non-bargaining employees.
If I may clarify, Ms. Lee, was actually 20% adjustment for me as interim, 20% on top of the base I was receiving at the time.
Okay. Mr. McLean, you recognize?
That she just answered my
Yes,
question.
sir,
It's on top of the base that Jeff is
currently making. Yes.
Yeah, the policy indicates that if the interim person is also discharging his current obligations as well as the additional ones, they get 15%. And if it's not, it's 10%. But the historical approach has been, I believe Ms. Egan got 20% the last time you did this, and the board does have the authority to decide with its plenary power to change its own policy. So that's going to be an issue for the board to set the compensation. I would suggest we have staff come through and say, here's what 10%, 15%, and 20% would be, and so you can then have an informed decision or make an informed decision.
All right. Let me ask another question. And I'm doing this. I didn't see anywhere where if when we hire a CEO that Mr. Seward would be able to go back to his job.
It's a part of the agreement, the actual draft document you have before you.
Yeah, I've drafted that document already. It's in your backup material. It does specifically say that.
Okay. All right.
If I could, Chair, I'm sorry, Mr. McLean. In some ways, this is a negotiated thing, too. I mean, I want to make sure that Mr. Seward is okay with whatever direction we take this, because if we go to the board and then he doesn't accept the 15%, he thinks that he should get 20%, because he'll be doing essentially sort of the same things that he was doing that Ms. Egan was doing previously, which was doing two different jobs in the interim basis.
No. He won't be doing two different jobs. He won't be doing the CFO's job. He'll be doing just the CEO's
He'll just
job.
be doing that, right?
Yes.
Okay. I just want to make sure of that. All right. Thank you. That clarifies it for me.
And the recommended salary in the draft document reflects what we believe would be a fair compensation for him at that point, and we have reviewed that on a tentative basis with Mr. Seward.
Okay.
Mr. McLean,
Yeah. One question. I mean, as we look at moving Jeff up, who rolls into Jeff's spot?
Lucia Campello will be the interim CFO.
Okay. And do we need to do this for the interim CFO also?
And if I can jump in, no, you do not. So a point to clarify to David, the CEO is your employee. Everybody else essentially works for HART. Okay. The CEO works for the board. The policies which David is discussing of the 10%, 15% are germane to HART employees. The board can do, the board's pleasure on a CEO salary because it's not necessarily governed within that. What we've done historically is the CEO interim receives a 20% bump, acknowledging that the difference between a staff position and the CEO is pretty significant and not necessarily what someone has signed out for. Everything else would be governed by the regular policies of a backfill. So the process for Mr. Campillo's compensation and the terms does not have to come to the board for approval.
Will be governed by the handbook language that we currently have.
And the number in the interim CEO agreement is $180,000, I believe.
Yes, it is.
That's been discussed with Mr. Seward. He's okay with that number?
Yes.
Okay, what's your pleasure?
I think we move the recommendation on the strategy for the appointment of the interim CEO.
Second.
There's a motion by Councilman Suarez, second by Mr. McLean. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor, let me know, saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, likewise. Motion adopted. Thank you, ma'am. HART CEO Performance and Evaluation for 2017. Mr. Smith.
Okay, I provided you, I believe, a scintillating 3, maybe 4-page memo on the issues relevant to the CEO's existing agreement. It's not nearly as complicated as the memorandum made it, in retrospect. Essentially, what we have is a contractual obligation that Ms. Egan is to be paid her deferred compensation on a prorated basis through her departure. But I understand from talking with Ms. Lee, that's made on a check-by-check basis anyway. So there's no amount that needs to be made up. That's happening. So you don't have to take any action in that regard. That's going to continue. The only other issues are her evaluation and whether you look at a merit increase on an interim basis. And I gave you all the background. The language looks to almost be imperative with regard to the evaluation, but the merit increase is optional, so it doesn't really make a lot of sense necessarily unless there's some reason you want to go through the evaluation process at this point to do so. And it does indicate that the merit increase can be postponed and it can be made effective at a date different than the beginning of the year. So it's totally within the board's discretion whether you make a merit increase. So if you're not going to do a merit increase, I would recommend you not have an evaluation. I believe the CEO would agree with that if that's where you go.
Yes, sir, and I did want to clarify, we, beginning last year, we've moved away from merit increases, so the contract would line me up with what staff has received. We are clearly not saying do an evaluation and give me a raise for 3 more weeks. We have moved to pay for performance, so we do a lump sum payout at the end of the year. But again, I'm a turncoat, I believe.
Well, you need coats. It's going to be cold.
I will need coats. So I'll defer to the pleasure of the board.
Not even joking. You're not at all. Not at all.
What's your pleasure? Question. You have a question, Ms. Melinda?
I think based on what Mr. Smith said, we don't have to move anything or just other than to leave it as is.
You are free to make a decision with regard to what you think any compensation adjustment might be, and that's going to be a board decision. It may be that this executive committee doesn't want to make a recommendation in that regard, which is also a possibility. And you can leave it to the board to decide, or you can make a recommendation you not have one. I mean, I'm not trying to make a policy call here. I'm just trying to advise you what your options are.
Okay.
Well,
I'm under the understanding that, you know, we wouldn't go through the process of an evaluation. That's just my personal feeling of it. So I wasn't sure if anyone else had anything different than that. No, so my recommendation is that we don't go through the performance evaluation.
Okay. I agree with that.
Okay.
In your regular calendar, post dates my tenure. So what you would usually do would be to review the CEO's evaluation in January and make any adjustments in February. And I clearly will not be here for that. So there's not a. Till it gets really cold, sir.
I hope it freezes every. Go ahead.
Thank you, sir.
Well, you can feel the love.
Okay, is that the recommendation of the committee?
Yes, sir.
Okay, very good, very good. Is there anything further we need to discuss then?
No, sir. Not from my.
Anything further? Anything further? Seeing none, we're adjourned.
Thanks.
Aye.
And for board